47, part 3. We're going to start with paragraph 9. We've been talking about separation of powers and why it's important, because no separation of powers, no rule of law. You'll have arbitrary law. You don't know what kind of law to follow. You don't know whether the people that you've entrusted with power are going to themselves follow the law or not. You don't want a tyranny, so you separate the powers, and here separate the branches. And here Madison is looking at what Montesquieu has written, has said, because anti-federalists are quoting Montesquieu. And he says, I agree with Montesquieu, but there are certain things that he missed. Montesquieu says you have to have 3 distinct branches, totally separated from each other. But as we see, not only in the British system, the system is not 100% separated from one another. They have partial agency. One department has partial agency over the other one. But the state governments, the state constitutions in the United States do the same thing too, as he's going to start talking about the state constitutions. Again, Madison is talking about, by citing the state constitutions, he's telling us that not only we are well read, we the people who wrote this constitution were very informed, we've read the history of the world, but we also have been looking at the history of the United States, especially this last 11 years, since the beginning of the revolution all the way to 1787. We're going to learn, we've learned from what the states have done, from their mistakes, from what's good about their constitution. So this is what makes the Federalist Papers very important, because it's work of 55 people got together that had never happened before, with multiple interests from different parts of America, and they had to come together, come to an understanding. And finally, they wrote this Constitution after a long deliberation, and 39 of them signed it. So this is great, because it's the first time that so many people gathered together to write a Constitution. It was not just written by one tyrant or authoritarian person. And they deliberated, and they had to compromise. And Madison here is saying, not only we were well informed about history of the world, but we were wise enough to see what has happened in different states. In this case, he wants to tell us what the state constitutions had done, that they had not totally 100% separated branches. And that's why Montesquieu might have overlooked, and it's good for us to look at our own state constitutions too. So let me start reading here. If we look into the constitutions of the several states, we find that, notwithstanding the emphatical and in some instances the unqualified terms in which this axiom has been laid down, there is not a single instance in which the several departments of power have been kept absolutely separate and distinct. There's not even one example that these branches have been kept absolutely distinct. New Hampshire, whose constitution was the last formed, seems to have been fully aware of the impossibility and inexpediency of avoiding any mixture whatever of these departments, and has qualified the doctrine by declaring that the legislative, executive, and judiciary powers ought to be kept as separate from and independent of each other as the nature of free government will admit, or as is consistent with the chain of connection that binds the whole fabric of the Constitution in one indissoluble bond of unity and amity. So it's New Hampshire that has written the last Constitution amongst these 13 states. He says, yes, we want separation of powers, but we know that for the fabric of society and for fabric of the Constitution to work for the whole of society, there should be some attachment there. There should be some partial agency of one department over another. Her Constitution accordingly mixes these departments in several respects. The Senate, which is a branch of the legislative department, is also a judicial tribunal for the trial of impeachment. So see, this is what it's talking about. It says if they're going to impeach somebody, the Senate has to have a say in it. The president, who is the head of the executive department, is the presiding member also of the Senate. Again, another mixture. And besides an equal vote in all cases, has a casting vote in case of a tie. His vote will be a tiebreaker if there's a tie in the Senate of the New Hampshire. The executive head is himself eventually elective every year by the legislative department. So the governor is going to be elected by the legislative department. And his council is every year chosen by and from the members of the same department. Several of the officers of state are also appointed by legislature, and the members of the judiciary department are appointed by the executive department. The next paragraph. The Constitution of Massachusetts has observed a sufficient, though less pointed caution in expressing this fundamental article of liberty. It declares that the legislative department shall never exercise the executive and judicial powers or either of them. The executive shall never exercise the legislative and judicial powers or either of them. This declaration corresponds precisely with the doctrine of Montesquieu, as it has been explained, and is not in a single point violated by the plan of the convention, which means this new constitution. It goes no further than to prohibit any one of the entire departments from exercising the powers of another department. In the very constitution to which it is prefixed, a partial mixture of powers has been admitted. Again, the word partial. The executive magistrate has a qualified negative on the legislative body. In other words, governor can veto a qualified veto of the laws that comes through the legislature. And the Senate, which is a part of the legislature, is a court of impeachment for members both of the executive and the judiciary department. See again, Senate plays that role in the impeachment cases. The members of the judiciary department again are appointed by the executive department and removable by the same authority on the address of the two legislative branches. Lastly, a number of officers of government are annually appointed by the legislative department. As the appointment to officers, particularly executive offices, is in its nature an executive function, the compilers of the Constitution have, in this last point at least, violated the rule established by themselves. So there is a mistake here. There's a violation of the rule that the Massachusetts themselves has talked about. He says, I pass over the constitutions of Rhode Island and Connecticut. He's not going to look at the constitutions of Rhode Island and Connecticut because they were formed prior to the Revolution, and even before the principle under examination had become an object of political attention. Rhode Island and Connecticut, they had stuck to their old constitution that was written before the Revolution, and they changed it in early 1800s, okay? But at the time that he's writing these papers, they still had their old constitutions. And we will continue in the next video.